Aubrey Allegressi's here for the Times. Aubrey, good to see you. Very good morning to you.
Thanks for having me.
Bad night for the Tories. One of the worst nights they've had, really, in their history, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is. Professor John Curtis said he thought it was the worst performance by the Conservatives at a local government election in up to the last 40 years.
Yeah.
And
wow.
I think so much of what the Conservatives have tried to sort of say in the run-up to this point was, this is priced in, this is factored in. The Conservatives did really, really well when they were contesting these same seats in 2021.
Yeah.
It was almost the high sort of peak of Boris Johnson's premiership.
Right.
Sir Keir Starmer was even considering resigning in the aftermath of them. That's how bad they were for Labour then. So I suppose that's the Conservative spin, but obviously Labour are able to point to a significant early victory in Blackpool South, and then they're seeing these swings across the board in councils and police and crime commissioner seats as well, which they haven't taken since these posts were created in 2012.
Right, and the 26% swing in Blackpool South, if it was, extrapolated across the general election, would mean Labour would have a massive majority, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, these are obviously by-elections, so people vote in a slightly different way, and turnout across these elections is always going to be quite a lot lower.
Yes.
But it is supposed to be something like the third biggest swing to the Labour Party at a by-election in history, so really significant for them, but not out of kilter with everything we've seen over the last few years. You remember they took places like Selby and Ainsley in literally Rishi Sunak's backyard in North Yorkshire. So I think they'll be very pleased with this result, but few surprises at it.
Exactly right. And the reason we're hearing for a lot of people voting or not voting for the Tory party is just that they're fed up. You know, there's not necessarily any great policy that the Labour Party have put out that people are voting for. They just want a change, don't they?
That is certainly the Conservative line. They're basically arguing there is no love for Keir Starmer, and people are almost voting sort of by default, or they're staying at home. And that cost the Tories significantly, even in 1997, you know. People make comparisons to Tony Blair and say Keir Starmer is no Tony Blair, but part of the reason Tony Blair got such a big landslide was millions of Tory voters did stay at home. They didn't switch. And I think the Conservatives are still trying to send a message to their MPs that there is a path back here, there is still a way, as Rishi Sunak put it earlier this week, to pull off the greatest political comeback in history, but very few people are buying it. And the later and later it gets, the closer it gets to the general election, where Rishi Sunak has fewer and fewer chances to claim victory and success, the less he looks like a winner. Yeah, I mean, there's been an awful lot of optics, haven't there, this week? They've had, the first flight to Rwanda with somebody on it, albeit that he paid to go, £3,000, and he actually wanted to go, and he wasn't, in fact, being deported really at all. We saw the people yesterday being taken out of hotels and put into buses and put into the back of police vans. You know, all of those optics, obviously, well, maybe too little too late, but is there any chance that if Rwanda succeeds in some way, shape or form, that might change the public's view? It's possible that certainly Rishi Sunak can improve on his current performance. I mean, speaking to pollsters, they say that...
It can't get much worse, I suppose, right?
Well, you could say that, although I think, don't count your chickens. It could, that people were saying that 3-6 months ago, and it did get worse. Speaking to people over the last few days, they've basically been saying it takes about a week, maybe 2 weeks sometimes, for news to sort of filter down to the average member of Joe Public who doesn't, like me, obsess over every cough and spit of politics. So it may be that in about 2 weeks' time, we do see some potential shifts in voting intention based on, as you talked about, the Rwanda policy, potential sort of developments there. Labour now importantly saying this morning they do think that there'll be flights getting off the ground, which they haven't said before, and things like the uplift in defence spending to 2.5% by the end of the decade. But whether or not those are enough, it's just not quite clear. I mean, so many Conservative MPs say on the doorstep voters have turned off, they're just not listening anymore. And any message Rishi Sunak delivers, they believe, just isn't being heard properly.
Yes, and a lot of people saying to me today, just on messaging that's coming in, that they voted for the Tories, held their nose to do it because they didn't really want their council to go Labour. But in the general, they might go for reform. And Richard Tice has said that he's considering this to be a pretty good night for reform. I spoke to a polling expert earlier who said they haven't done as well as they should have done.
I think it's somewhere between the two. It's certainly been a sort of mixed bag. I mean, they are basically polling about they're getting results that tally with where they are in the opinion polls. However, they're only standing in about 1% of seats here. These are seats that they really should be doing better in. They're at the sorts of seats where they should be exceeding their national average projected vote share. And certainly nearly getting the Tories in second place in Blackpool South is sort of close to being a scalp for Richard Tice.
But it would have been a much better scalp if they'd got second, wouldn't it?
Certainly. And obviously in the national opinion polls, you're seeing that gap narrow the difference between Reform and the Conservatives is now basically within the margin of error.
Right.
And so to your point earlier where you said, well, it can't get much worse, I think there are some MPs who think, well, it might get worse.
Sure.
And what happens if Reform start tipping into second place?
Right. So will they be panicking, do you think, in Downing Street? And will the rebels, who we heard from, say, a week or so ago, who said, look, if it's really bad on Friday, you know, we might be having to have a conversation about replacing Rishi Sunak. Will those conversations will be taking place?
I'm sure there will be panic in Downing Street, but they probably will be doing their best not to let it show. I mean, interestingly, Dame Andrea Jenkins, who is one of those who has basically called for Rishi Sunak to go, one of only 2 Tory MPs, this morning was saying that she didn't think that MPs were lining up to put letters of no confidence in, and she didn't think that the leader was going to change before the next general election. Certainly the MPs I've spoken to who are still deeply unhappy with Rishi Sunak and critical of him privately aren't planning to do so. But a lot rests on what unfolds over the next 48 hours. Things could get a little bit better. They could also get a lot worse.
Right. Could we also see perhaps another sort of long line of Tory MPs who haven't yet said that they're going to step down at the next election, now going to say, actually, I'm not going to bother. I'm going to step down because they don't want to be humiliated?
Quite possibly, yes. I think it was December last year when all MPs were given that deadline to say whether they were restanding, and lots of people said they were planning to and then changed their mind a few months later. So again, the closer the election gets, the more people are likely to see the writing on the wall and think there's no way out of this. Either I don't fancy a gruelling election campaign, or I don't fancy being elected and then sitting in Parliament in opposition for 5 or 10 years, however long it might be.
Yeah.
And so I suspect there will be more MPs who come forward and say they're not planning to stand. There are fears basically that the Conservative Party has been trying to eke this out, elongate the process so it doesn't look too much like a sort of flood and it's more of a sort of constant stream.
Yes, indeed.